And we're live. It is Friday, August the 22nd, the year of our Lord 2025, and it has already been a long day. It is only 8 o'clock in the morning, but this is my second live stream of the day. It's my nth cup of coffee. I've already had interactions with law enforcement, and folks, the sun is shining. The birds are chirping. It's going to be a great friggin' day. I want to tell you about my morning. I got up at 4 to go to the house of John Bolton. And uh, I was not invited to the house of John Bolton, but I just thought, what a good day it would be to take a stroll by the house of John Bolton. And I ran into some Montgomery County police officers who were confused to see me out there, and I suspect wondered if I might be Iranian intelligence who has a particular interest in John Bolton, like they want to kill him. But no, that's not why I was there. I was not there in any way to threaten John Bolton or to harass him or just merely to stake out his house because of something that then happened at right around 7 o'clock, just as I was about to leave and decide the whole thing was just one of those, things that sometimes you imagine it's a good day to be in front of John Bolton's house and it's not. And a whole bunch of police vehicles showed up, including a bunch of FBI vehicles. And yes, they were there to execute a search warrant against the house of John Bolton. Here is everything I know on Dogshirt, on the live stream this morning, which was from the site. I said a lot of this. I'm going to say it again. This appears to be a search warrant in connection with the 2020 publication of Bolton's book. You'll recall that book was about his time as National Security Advisor. You will recall that he tried to get it through pre-pub review, and the pre-pub review process was stalled and was a particularly obnoxious one. And so he eventually went ahead and uh, published it without that process. The Trump administration claimed there was classified material in it, sued to try to stop him from publishing it. Um, and um, uh, and then that investigation died with the Biden administration, with the income of the Biden administration. That appears to have been revived. The statute of limitations, I have to figure out exactly when it will run, but it will run soon. It's 5 years old now. And so they appear to be in full can we get this over the finish line and indict John Bolton mode. And I believe that is what this is about. Among the various national security officials who they would like to indict, I think Bolton is really the only one with any plausible exposure, at least that I know of. He did, after all, publish a book after jettisoning the pre-pub review process. So this is a loose end that maybe they think they can close, and apparently they convinced a judge to give a search warrant for. Um, uh, so I want to raise three concerns about this case, this matter, and frankly, the three of them together are the reason that I was out there this morning. The first is that I was pretty confident that they would leak it to favored news outlets, and which they did within minutes of the thing. The New York Post, which, by the way, was not there at the scene that I saw, unless they got a ride along with the Bureau. They were, I think, just the recipient of a leak. And uh, uh, I was concerned that, they were going to, do that. And so I wanted somebody to just be there and film and do it independently. The second reason is that I can't imagine the world in which it is appropriate to do to get whatever material they're looking for from Bolton by search warrant rather than by subpoena. Um, uh, Normally, you use a search warrant only in a situation in which you don't trust that somebody will comply with a subpoena. John Bolton, I have my political differences with him, which are substantial, of course, and I have, there are things he's done that I've very much disapproved of. They're not in the way of legal compliance with things like subpoenas. I have no reason to think that if you hand John Bolton a subpoena for documents X, Y, and Z, he will not comply with it in good faith. Um, and um, and so when you show up at somebody's house and do this and you immediately leak it to the New York Post because you're interested in the theatrics of it, and this is something that you could have done by calling his lawyer and saying, "Hey, we need the following documents, and we're going to subpoena them if you don't turn them over voluntarily." That is an abuse, and I feel pretty strongly about that, and I was so that's the second reason. The third reason is because this is a scalp hunting exercise, and they want to indict national security officials from the last. I mean, this is a national security official from their administration, but they are not going to get to indict Jim Clapper, uh, uh, Jim Comey, uh, you know, uh, Avril Haines, whoever the list of people who are on there, Jim Baker, they're not going to get to indict them because they didn't do anything. And so this is one where they want the theatricality and they want the scalp and they're running out of time. And so that is why I was out there. The full video will be available as soon as as Substack finishes rendering it. There's not a lot of information in it that I didn't just convey, but it does have some snazzy pictures of cop cars and that sort of thing, uh, all of which is an 8-minute long way of saying that we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are occasionally allowed to go out and trail law enforcement and delay the introduction of our guest with a wholly unrelated monologue about activity this morning. Um, Look, folks, you're watching Dog Shirt TV, and it is a fucking revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features, of which there are many, is that sometimes I go stake out a house in the morning, but I always get back in time for Dog Shirt uh, uh, TV. And 8 o'clock is sacrosanct, and um, and I actually cut the live stream short because I had to be back in this chair in time for Dog Shirt TV. And another one of the revolutionary features is that sometimes we have absolutely bewildered guests who have to sit through a how did I get myself into this situation? What's going on? Who are you? And Ev, what did you do to me to get me here? And so, without further ado, Ev Gaumond, why don't you introduce our guest? And we're just going to radically change subjects.
I'm not sure we will switch subject that much. It is a pleasure to welcome Louis-Philippe Lampron on the show. He is a fellow French Canadian Québécois, but worry not, I really think that he will have some relevant stuff to say actually, because he is a constitutional law professor at Laval University in Quebec City, focusing on civil rights, civil liberties, human rights, charter rights, as we may call it in Canada. And he was in the US last year during the election to study the elections, study maybe um, think about how we could reshape freedom of expression in light of recent events, technology, AI. But throughout the process, I think he switched focus because of the kind of stuff that happened this morning at John Bolton House. And I think that he probably broadened the scope of his research and writing to cover a larger range of human rights, I think. Am I right, Professor
Yeah,
Lampron?
you're totally right.
Could you just simply tell us what was your initial project and how you are currently reframing it?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for it's quite amusing, as a matter of fact, how I went to get on this show because I found the Lawfare website and I was kind of, completely taken aback by this important resource for non-Americans that want to see who is fighting back against this administration. And so I posted it online, and Eve Gaumond just saw it and did one thing led to the other, and I'm here. As for the project, it was a sabbatical. It was a part of my sabbatical year, and I've decided because in Quebec, in the French Canadian part of
And
Canada,
where did you spend your sabbatical year?
New York City. I didn't spend all of it. I was there from August 2024 until mid-December. So I was there for the presidential election, and I had the pleasure, quote unquote, to participate in the MSG rally of Trump in October, as a matter of fact. And that was kind of, undercover because, and at the time, the fact to be Canadian and not a journalist, I think it was an advantage for me to be able to stay there and to take, because I was taking frantically notes about what was happening. And my neighbor just asked me because he was seeing me not getting up when it was time to get up and to applaud and to take notes. Are you a journalist? And I said, no, 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 I'm not a journalist. I'm a law professor. Yeah, right. No, 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 no. I'm Canadian. I'm from Canada, and I'm not, in no way. I'm not from CNN, and I'm not an undercover journalist. So don't throw me out. And he then went on to say to me, Canada. I hear that Justin Trudeau is a dictator, right? And said, okay, so where should I go from to explain it to? Anyway, so it was quite the adventure, and I was telling it to Eve a few moments ago. But I think that the fact that I was really mainly interested in AI and disinformation and the impact on election, and less so to the protection of the rule of law and to protection of democratic institution, was the fact that I was tricked by Trump. It was the same thing for me as a Canadian, as foreigner, as 2016, when the night of election, I promised my son, he was 11 years old at the time, that there was no way, it was impossible that Trump would win the election because, it was kind of the electoral projection were 99% for the election of Hillary Clinton at the time. And during the night, it was, it just went over. Anyway, so it was the same thing because of January 6th, and because of all the convictions. And I was of the impression, under the impression it was not possible that Trump win a second term. And then he did. And I was really worried about the repetition at that time of January 6th event in the event that he was losing the election. So what will happen? What will be the contestation of the election, and so on. But then he wins, and he wins broadly, and then everything just unraveled. And I'm really, really worried about as you are, about the protection of the rule of law and the democratic institution. So right now I am working in Canada. I guess that I have more questions than I have answers for you because I'm not an expert in American constitutional law, but I am an expert in Canadian constitutional law. For the moment, we're still a country. We're not the 51st state, right? So the project I'm working on right now is an essay about how could we reinforce our how shall I say it, our rule to be able to protect ourselves from Trump, a Canadian Trump, and those kind of abuse of power. So I'm kind of analyzing what I see as clear and repetitive abuse of power from the Trump administration, like per se trying to search and warrant John Bolton, and to transpose it in Canadian law and to see uh, are the loophole that Trump and Al are exploiting existing in Canada? And sadly, yes, they are. And for some purposes, they're wider than the loopholes that are existing in American law, from my perspective.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
walk us
so
through that. If we had, sorry, Ev, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
no, I was actually going to ask exactly the same question. If we want to have like safeguards for when the America can like wake up from their nightmares and like have a coalition of healthy democracies awaiting for them, how do we strengthen our constitutions to learn from the mistakes that the guys down there are currently witnessing?
Yeah. But what I'm seeing right now, and when you're talking about protection of human rights in Canada, in Quebec and Canada, and the Bill of Rights, we are under the same kind of regime, as a matter of fact, because we have general courts that are allowed to mettre en œuvre the human rights, and to if you want to contest a decision, a governmental decision, you turn to courts and you say, I think it's violating one of my human rights, and so if it does, it's invalid, constitutionally invalid. So I see two main problems in Canada, but I guess that what Trump is abusing, especially, is all the little loopholes that we are seeing in old laws like the Alien and Enemies Act and the Constitution, allowing the executive branch to use emergency powers. And so there's a lot of laws in American law, and I'm not an expert, so maybe maybe you tell me wrong, but in Canadian law, it's the same thing, that the legislative branch will delegate powers to the executive for emergency crisis. But the definition of crises are led to the discretion of the executive, and this is what Trump administration is abusing right now. And the fact is that to stop those kind of abusive interpretation of what constitute a crisis, what constitute an invasion, what constitute a national emergency, like the fentanyl crisis, the so-called fentanyl crisis at the border, the Canadian borders with the U.S., to justify, legally speaking, the implementation of those tariffs. There's the judiciary is really slow to be able to oppose those kind of abusive invocation of those emergency powers. So I guess that if we have the chance to see a coup not succeeding, because from my perspective, what Trump is trying right now is the legal coup. It's not a putsch. It's not a military putsch, at least not yet, but it's a legal coup, and he's trying to push the institutions to give way to an authoritarian way of using executive power. So if we have the chance that courts ultimately refuse those kind of interpretation, I guess that Congress, and the same thing in Canada as well, will have to narrow the scope given to executive to use this delegation of powers to face a crisis. And I guess that the main way to do that is to recognize the fact that those emergency powers should be used only for short period of times.
Or, in the alternative, you could take the position that, at least in the US context, most of them exist by grace of Congress in the first place. And
Absolutely.
I mean, I understand the value of the Alien Enemies Act before you had an INA. But now we have a comprehensive scheme that regulates immigration in all contexts. You don't need a 1798 statute that's written in these broad, terms anymore. Similarly, I don't know that you need a statute that lets the president take over the National Guard of a state without consulting the governor of the state. Now, you did need that in the era of massive resistance to Brown v. Board of Ed, but I just don't know, that, like, I would want Congress in an ideal world, and granted, we live in far from an ideal world, to go through every one of these emergency and say, how afraid of we are we of the emergency, as opposed to how afraid are we of the abuse of the claimed emergency by a deranged person who has a 51% plus one of the of 50% plus one of the vote share. And I used to be very much in the former camp of people who believed in a strong executive, uh, um, but now believe in a weaker executive because I trust the voting population less to choose an executive than I used to. But I'm curious, the Canadian structure is very different because, so first of all, in Canada, it's impossible to be the executive without the ongoing, uh, at least tacit consent of a majority of the parliament, but also because the arrangements of power between the federal and the provincial governments is just so radically different from in the
Absolutely.
United States. And so I want to ask you, you know, you guys had a proto-Trump figure
Yeah.
in the in Rob Ford, somewhere between Trump and Marion Barry, and he made it as high as mayor of the largest city in the country, and then mercifully dropped dead. Um, and his brother, who is somewhat more presentable and does seems to have the crack addiction under control, has been a much more successful politician, but doesn't seem to be nationally plausible. And so I'm curious, you know, like at a national level, Canadian politics is, I mean, Alicia tells me that I'm wrong, but it seems pretty placid, and the distance between Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney seems to me a lot like what the distance that American politics used to have. And so I'm curious, how concerned are you about spread of this into Canada, and how much more effectively would the Canadian constitutional system check it than the US constitutional system?
Those are really interesting and wide questions, right? At first, I would like to say that there's, yeah, a major distinction, constitutional distinction between our way of dealing with government, the fact that we are in parliamentary context is the fact that we is beginning with the election of the legislative branch, and whoever party has the majority of seats in the House of Commons, same thing in Quebec, will be able to have his prime minister as the chief of the party, will be also the chief of the executive. And there's a huge confusion between the executive branch and the legislative branch in Canadian law because of the fact that there's this ligne de parti, which more or less forces members of one party to vote with the party all the time on all subjects. And it's really an exception that the parties will allow a free vote, which means that if you are deciding to vote against the party, you will most likely be excluded from government. So it's a strong grasp from the executive on the legislative branch. And so the when you're talking about separation of power, the fact that the legislative should be able to block some projects of the executive, the ligne de parti is kind of prohibiting that per se. And so we are left with the judiciary, and it's taking a lot of time if you're trying to contest a decision made by a parliament that would be contrary to human rights. But it can take 10 years before you have a final decision from the Supreme Court of Canada. So there's all those kind of differences that are, I would say, all different. So breaches in the rocks that may be abused of if you are confronted to bad faith prime minister. You were talking about Rob Ford, which is a late figure, and he was only the mayor of the biggest city of Canada, Toronto. But recently we had Pierre Poilievre. And as a matter of fact, you're right to say that Canadian decided to elect Mark Carney, but we have to remind that if Trump hasn't been elected, and if Trump didn't go off the rail with all the 51st state threats and the attacks against the Canadian economy with the imposition of tariffs under the so-called threat that will represent the fentanyl crisis at the northern border, I don't think that Carney would have been elected because it was really a major part about this election. And so before the election of Trump, Poilievre was way ahead in the polls and was way ahead. The Trudeau government was crumbling apart. There was a lot of problems within the Liberal government. And we were under the impression that it was not whether or not Poilievre would be the next prime minister at the time, but with what would be his majority at the House of Commons. And Poilievre is kind of playing the Trump playbook. It's not Trump by a far, and nobody's Trump, right? But he's playing the populist playbook, and it would have been the first federal government, if he had been elected, to use the notwithstanding clause in the Canadian Charter. And this is really the nuclear weapon that it's a good thing that Trump isn't able to play with our version of the notwithstanding clause of the human
Yeah.
rights Canadian Charter, because
And
as a
Can
just
you
matter of fact,
remind
explain?
us,
Can you explain?
remind
Yeah.
what the notwithstanding clause is for people
yeah.
who are relentlessly American.
We have, though, the Canadian Charter, which is enshrined into the Constitution since 1982, and you have to respect as a government, as a legislator, the human rights protected in the Canadian Charter. But this tool, and it played a major role in the capacity of the governments at the time in 1982 to uh, have a deal and to be able to have a constitutional charter of human rights into the 1982 Constitution, but the interpretation of that clause that will allow a legislator to just suspend the main human rights protected by the Canadian Charter is you just have to put it into a law. And from the time you're doing that, the courts are offside. They don't have their say. They're not able to ask you as a legislator, why did you suspend the human rights? You don't have to put forward any motive. You don't have to be in a situation of national emergency, crisis. You don't have to invent one like the fentanyl crisis on the northern border. You just have to put it into the law, and the human rights can't be implemented by Canadian courts. So it's a nuclear weapon for an eventual bad faith government.
Think of it as the "we're doing it anyway" clause. When the U.S. Supreme Court says you can't do this, it violates the Bill of Rights. You can't
Absolutely.
do it
Yeah.
without violating a court order or defying the Supreme Court. When the Canadian Supreme Court says you can't do this, you can invoke the notwithstanding clause, and it's and you're not actually defying the court. You're just saying it's like the "we're doing it anyway." It's kind of a derogation if you think
Absolutely.
if in international law terms. It's kind of a cool concept actually, and I think it's a pretty interesting one. And Canada is one of relatively few countries that has a legislative override. Um, okay, so now imagine Prime Minister Donald Trump, and presumably he would be anti-Trump because all of Canada is anti-Trump, but Trumpy, Trumpy anti-Trump like figure. What's the abusive stuff he could do with the notwithstanding clause?
If you look at the rights that may be suspended by the notwithstanding clause, I was telling you that those were the main ones. So it's kind of tricky because there was constitutional law before the charter. So you're allowed to suspend the human rights that are enshrined in the charter, but what would that mean for the pre-1982 constitutional law? So there's kind of a void there that would have to be enlightened by the Supreme Court of Canada and after a long contestation. But uh, if you are looking at the human rights protected by the Human Rights Canadian Charter that may be suspended, you're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of association, so to public gatherings. You're talking about the right to equality, so the prohibition of discrimination. You're talking about the right to live, to security, so those are the main civil rights protected by the Canadian Charter, and you're able, by a stroke of a pen, to suspend those rights and to put the Canadian courts offside. The main debate right now in Canada is the fact that since 2019, Quebec, the legislative government, led by the CAQ government, Coalition Avenir Québec, they adopted a law on la laïcité de l'État, and they've decided to use preemptively the notwithstanding clause. So they
Particularity.
this a secularity, right? And so they've decided to not wait for the court to say to them that it was not compatible with the Canadian human rights. And they said, we don't want the court to say to us anything. We are under the impression that we have the right to pass that law. And it's not to Canadian courts to tell the Quebec government how to deal with the secularism in the state of Quebec. So, because of that, it's going to be in front of the Supreme Court soon. There's a huge constitutional case that will be rendered. It will be not revolutionary, but lose or win, it will lead to a constitutional crisis because of the scope of Section 33 that is now contested in front of the Supreme Court. They are essentially asking the court to review the criteria put forward in the Ford ruling in 1988 because they're too broad and because there's this risk to avoid the effectiveness of this major counterpower that is Canadian human rights of charter. And they are asking at least the Supreme Court to recognize the fact that you cannot use preemptively the notwithstanding clause because then you, as a population, you are not, you don't have the right to hear what the courts would have to say about the law that has been passed by a particular legislator. But for the moment, the Quebec government is using the notwithstanding clause compatibly with the state of the law, Canadian law since the Ford ruling in 1988.
Which was about language rights, the thing that Americans are kind of like mind boggled all the time when you say, like, yeah, it was about Bill 101,
Yeah,
right?
Bill. It was all about Bill 101 and the fact that Quebec is the only state in North America to be composed of a majority of French-speaking population, and so we passed this law. It was I guess that it was a Lévesque government in 1976 that passed this bill that said that at the time, if you want to advertise, and the main language, the national language is French, and it was contested by the English minority, which is the majority in the rest of North America. So it kind of double standard there, but and it was contested under freedom of speech. And there's this whole battle that was that led to the Ford ruling. But one part of the Ford ruling was about the use of the notwithstanding clause by the Lévesque government at the time. He didn't suspend the Quebec charter; he just suspended the rights of the Canadian charter. And so this is where the Supreme Court said, because of the wording of Section 33, right? The only interpretation at the time was that to protect the possibility of provinces to um, withdraw from a too centralistic, federally speaking, interpretation of the Canadian Charter by Supreme Court of Canada, because those are judges that are appointed by the federal government. Because of that, we have to give a broad interpretation of Section 33. So it's all coming about this contestation in 1988.
Yeah, and from
All right.
one
So
fort to another. Oh,
no,
no.
go ahead.
Well, from one fort to another
Yep.
recent use of the notwithstanding clause is in Ontario.
Hmm.
They amended the Elections Act about spending caps to
Yep.
avoid like election being purchased. And
Yep.
the first time they amended the law, it was the courts told them that their new regime was not constitutional, so they used the notwithstanding clause to prevent the courts from uh, acting in these circumstances. So at the moment, the notwithstanding clause is also used to um, mingle with political rights, and in Alberta, it is also used to um, act on trans issues. So it is really,
Absolutely.
really a kind of bazooka. And yeah, and do
And
you want
it's
to follow up?
Yeah, and it's a bazooka. And the reasoning of the Supreme Court in 1988 was the only sanction, and this is why, as a matter of fact, no government until 2019 used the notwithstanding clause for. It was used for a wide variety of reasons, technical reasons, to protect some laws that weren't affecting minority rights, right? So the fact that in Canadian society, in Canadian socio-political context, no government wanted to use that right to protect a controversial law was saying a lot of things about the political context, right? The fact that those governments were under the impression that they will be sanctioned by the population in the next election if they were using that notwithstanding clause in a way that will affect minority rights. But now we are in a totally different environment. And the reasoning, and from my perspective, I sincerely hope that the Supreme Court will evolve the criteria to narrow the wide discretion margin that is for the moment let under the legislators. And so if the only sanction that you can oppose to a law that will affect trans rights or religious minority groups is the next election. So it's all about, going against the principle that has been enshrined in all human rights texts since the end of the World War. The fact that since then, because we saw what democracy could lead to if it was only summarized to the right of the majority of the population, we can sue, horrible exactions against minority groups. So we have to have a bottom line. So democracies from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is not anymore the rule of the democracy decide for everything. You can't do, even if you have the support of the majority, you can put forward decisions that will abuse of those majority rights against minority groups. And so you need courts to say no to governments if they are abusing those rights, because if not, so everything you're going back to pre World War II interpretation of human rights and say democracies is the majority who are deciding everything. And if you have the support of the majority against trans rights, against I don't know, for the I'm saying anything, but the hanging of the last president because he's a traitor, and you don't have judiciary guarantees anymore, it can lead right through authoritarianism. So this is why it's so dangerous, the actual criteria of the notwithstanding clause, because as a matter of fact, especially when you are trying to contest laws that are having effects against minority groups. You need courts to be able to have their say in the evaluation of the legality, the constitutionality of those laws.
All right, so I want to ask you about how much this is a hypothetical worry at the federal level in
Yeah.
Canada. Um, and I understand the point about Polyev being a little bit of a near miss. Um, but I have to say, from the United States uh, point of view, Polyev doesn't look that scary. He's kind of, you know, I understand if you're Canadian, that looks like populism and scary shit. But if you're American, it's chicken shit,
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah.
Um, and um, and what it's kind of like warmed over Trump from 4 months ago without the charisma. And um, so I'm trying to figure out. I look at Canada and I say, okay, I'm not that worried about Canada in the short term. In the long term, I'm very worried about it because I don't believe that democratic government is possible on the borders of the United States if it's not thriving inside the United States. I just think, you know, I understand that you guys aren't the 51st state, and as Ev can tell you, I'm very pro Canadian independence. But I also think the critical mass of the United States is immense, and Canada, even Quebec, will not stay democratic for long if we don't. Um, I, so these are interdependent variables. But I do look at Canada and I say at the federal level, I'm pretty complacent. And the reason is that, you know, the main protection is not the notwithstanding clause. It's the fact that, party control over voting behavior of members is not that strong. And so if you imagine a conservative government that is, you know, kind of bad, it may not have a majority. It may have to rely on, the Bloc Québécois, which will, demand its pounds of flesh and abandon, like the idea that you could have a stable authoritarian coalition at the federal level in Canada just seems a little improbable to me. Now, I say that having spent a lot of time saying something similar about the United States, but I also don't know how stable this authoritarian coalition is in the sense that, it barely has a majority, it can barely get things passed. It's, it may last as little as 2 years. And so I guess I'm asking you, how much do you think the concerns that you're articulating here um, are real real concerns in the short and medium term in actual Canadian politics, and how much are they the sort of law school professor hypotheticals that we all do and we believe in, and you do them because they're important because they cause you to think through the constitutional structural issues, but really there are a lot of places we're worried about before we're worried about Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those are excellent questions. We are living not only through dangerous times, but when you're looking at what Trump is doing, right? It's always unheard of. And so, because it's unheard of, and because it's been 2 elections now, presidential election, I'm not an American, so I'm really, kind of looking from the outside. everything that I thought was impossible is just happening right now in the US, and not only in the US, but in Europe as well. We are seeing things in the Europe, the rise of the populism, the extremism in France and Italy, and it's not happening only with Trump. Trump is kind of the boldest uh, incarnation of what is happening worldwide in democracies, but still, we are not protected in Canada. And I guess that it's like a marriage contract. The time to write this contract is when you're in love, right? It's when everything is doing great, and we won't separate anymore. But still, if we were to have to do it, what would be the right way to have a separation, right? So I guess it's the same thing that I'm doing right now, and I'm totally sensible to the argument that if the legal coup that Trump is attempting right now, Trump and administration is attempting right now, and I totally agree with you when you're saying that they're not able to pass anything through Congress, but this is not what the Trump administration is doing. They're trying to extend the executive branch powers so that they won't need Congress anymore to do pretty much whatever they want to do. So if it was agreed upon by the Supreme Court of the US, and from out, again, from the outside looking in, I'm still putting all my hopes right now in Amy Coney Barrett, right? So it's saying a lot to say those kind of things. If I'm putting my hopes in the hand of Amy Coney Barrett, we are far, on that on this kind of road. It's not going well for us. So again, I think that I'll go back to what were my interests when I went to New York City to see the unraveling of the presidential election, is the fact that all democracies, we are a little bit stuck with the fact that we put our public forums and our public way to interact with each other into the hands of the GAFAM and tech bros. And so we don't own those public forums anymore, and we are totally reliant on those algorithms and those decisions and those attempt to influence the unraveling of other elections. And the fact that we think that we're able to get through to the population, but the decisions aren't made by us. Even if we are putting forward the best content and the most interesting one, at the end of it, and especially in the electoral context, there will be some kind of fillers that will be put upon those kind of contents by those tech bros. And they are aligning right now with the Trump administration of it and its agendas because it's profitable for them. So because of that, and because it can affect Canadian election as well, and all election, as a matter of fact, I'm kind of worried that if we are not changing the framework, we could have our own Trump moment in Canada as well, even if we are protected by the fact that it's not bipartisan in Canada right now. It was for a long time. We had mainly the Liberal Party and Conservative Party at federal level, and then at the end of the Brian Mulroney era, there's those kind of a lot of parties that emerged. And so right now there's a lot of minority government. So the fact that the prime minister has to negotiate with other parties to be able to pass any kind of decisions. But what we are seeing right now, and it has been described by many others and philosophists and as political scientists like Giorgio Agamben, is the fact that we are living in those kind of emergency state all the time since the beginning of since we're not World War II, but since the attack of September 9/11, as a matter of fact. And so per se, the executive is taking not all the place, but the major part of the governmental decisions, and the legislative branch is kind of there to maybe sometimes oppose projects of the executive, but because of emergency powers and the multiplication of those loopholes that may be um, used by those executives, it's kind of really, there's less and less democracy since the beginning of the 2000, as a matter of fact. So I totally, I'm not worried in the short term, but I think it's the responsible way to look at our constitution and look at our own flaws and to maybe comparatively look at what Trump's doing right now and to say, if someone was trying, if a government was trying to do what Trump is doing right now in the US, would he be able to succeed? And what the population would be able to impose to resist to those kind of attacks?
Yeah, so I actually disagree with you about on at least on the US side. I've never
Okay.
studied the Canadian side about the decline of democracy since 2001. I actually think one thing that's interesting to me about the Trumpian movement is how little it has relied on the security posture of the post 2001 era. So all these national emergency statutes, none of them are 9/11 statutes. All these, um, uh, I snap my fingers and I can, in fact, he is deconstructing the investigative posture of the FBI and I mean, he's making us super vulnerable to terrorist attacks. And so I think, at least in our context, it is much less the post 9/11 laws that civil libertarians got all anxious about, some of them rightly, some of them wrongly, in my view. And it is much more the latent power of, long dormant statutes like the Alien Enemies Act and like these, calling out the National Guard statutes. And I really think it is time to do a kind of legal uh, illustration of laws, not of people, although we may need one of people too. But really to say like, um, do we really need this law, and how do
Mhm.
we tighten it up? What kind of time limits can we put on it? You know, should the president be able to do that at all? And just go through them systematically with a post-Trump eye. Um, and I'm curious. I, I can list 30 of these laws in the United States now. I mean, they're basically just one after another of the ones that Trump has invoked. And you know, the the question is, what other than the notwithstanding clause, what are the statutes in Canada that you look at and say, this is well intentioned, but boy, is somebody going to mess with this?
Yeah, but in Quebec, there's we saw it with the COVID-19 crisis. There's the laws that are allowing government to take matters in their own hands. And when you're talking about emergency powers, it wouldn't be responsible to just say we cannot let the executive just decide from time to time and exceptionally to take matters into his own hands and to go faster than usual to be able to protect the population. If there's a national crisis, catastrophe, environmental, hurricane, or a pandemic. So it's a good thing that for the short period of time, we be able to do whatever we need to do to protect the population from a threat, from a collective threat, right? But the problem was that there was a loophole in the law, in the Quebec law at least, that allowed the government to maintain the state of emergency and to be able to govern by decree, by executive order for more than 2 years. So this is not, I think, acceptable from a democratic point of view because you have to live into legal framework that will allow the balance of powers between the three branches of government. And the state of emergency is the opposite of that. So if you are trying to maintain longer than necessary this kind of emergency powers, then it's always posing the risk that you won't be a democracy anymore, because if it's just the executive that is able to determine what are the rules that have to be obeyed by the population, this is not a democracy anymore. So I'm always referring to the very bad Star Wars movies of the Emperor. That's trying to. I know it sounds weird, but I'm a little bit of a geek, right? I have this Star Wars T-shirt. You don't have your dark shirt,
Look,
but
I
I
don't
have
have a
mine.
dog shirt, so we got to have some shirt discussion.
Yeah,
And Ev is just wearing a striped shirt.
yeah.
So
Well,
it's
I'm
good.
I'm in line
So
with jail attire.
Oh, good. Prison attire for Ev. But I
it's
think,
good.
it's not an episode of the show if we don't have some shirt
I'm
talk.
sure discussion.
So
We're talking X-wing
yeah,
right
X-Wing
there.
fighters are definitely the way to go.
That's perfect. And so when you're talking about that, it's a perfect example. It's a caricature, but still, it's a perfect example of how democracy may die. Because there's a war, and there's, everyone is really happy to give all powers to the head of the state. And the head of the state is telling them, thank you very much. It's with a lot of reluctance that I'm accepting those powers, and I will give them back as soon as I don't need them. But if you are a dictator, you will always need it. This is how you can put yourself into a bad situation. So uh, I guess that those kind of laws, I'm analyzing that, and there's a way to, as you were saying about American law, if there is a post-Trump era that allows us to just do this work. I think that what Trump is attempting right now, and on the hopeful side of things, maybe the Supreme Court won't get along with what Trump is proposing right now, with a finger crossed, right? But if they are not accepting that, I guess that there will be a moment for democracies to just repair and to close the loopholes that ease trying to abuse us. And the same thing in Canada. Those are there's some loopholes that may lead that may weaken our democracy, and I guess that it's responsible to take matters into, collectively speaking, our own hands right now, and to close those loopholes before we have our Trump moment.
And how many of those loopholes do you think are at the provincial level, and how many of them are at the federal level? In the United States, it feels like the problem is mostly at the federal level
Yeah,
right now. But that's because we have Trump, and because, however much I might not like Greg Abbott, he's not my problem because I
yeah.
live in the District of Columbia. Um, I, but there's a lot of shitty state policy. Um, and, but when you look around and you say, what are the democratic dangers in Canada? Are you thinking mostly about the CAC and Alberta, or are you thinking about Ottawa principally?
It's the same structure. So I'm thinking, at the federal and provincial levels, because we are vulnerable to populist moments, and the federal structure is the same as the provincial structure. We are in the same parliamentary model, and so there's flaws that may be weakened. Those flaws by the integration of a more proportional way of dealing with our elections. For the moment, it's all about parties, but some parties there's kind of distortions, electoral distortions. So maybe, and it's the same in Quebec right now, only with 40% of the vote, the CAC was allowed to have 72% of the votes inside the House. So it's because there's no proportional element to our elections. Those are kind of solutions that may protect us from abuses of powers in the future. But I would say that it's the same at the federal and the provincial levels, because the threat that we are dealing with right now, it's a global one in democracies, and the fact it's all having to do with the fact that we are collectively vulnerable to disinformation right now. And we are collectively vulnerable to those GAFAMs brothers that may influence our relations, even if we don't know about it. So because of that, there's a lot of flaws, democratically speaking, that are concerning to every population, not the Canadian one. So I would say that it's all what the risks I'm seeing looming at the horizon may affect us both at the federal and provincial levels, to answer your question directly.
Ev, you get the last word today.
uh,
Wow. Uh,
yep.
yeah, but I think that if I can take a crack at this question, I think we would probably be more vulnerable at the federal level, not for legal reasons, but for political reasons. I think that it is mainly the federal government that is in negotiation with Trump and that might be forced to bow down to him. We are seeing it at the moment with a bill like for the fentanyl
Steve.
stuff, the border
Yep.
stuff, C2.
Yep.
There are brand new powers given to law enforcement that are given to law enforcement to please Trump, and I think that is probably the main vulnerability because François Legault, the premier of Quebec, won't be talking to Trump, won't be negotiating with Trump, and so he won't have to make concessions to him, whereas Mike Carney will have. So
I will
thanks
also
very much,
I will also
Professor
just
Lampron.
add I just also add that uh, one of the weaknesses of Canada as a democratic structure in this regard is that all criminal law is federal. And so, in the American system, uh, you know, there's stuff that the federal government just doesn't have any say over
Hmm.
because it's left to states to deal with. And a lot of that stuff involves putting people in jail and, like Canada kind of flips that and gives the provinces immense power over things like languages and language and things like healthcare, but much less over stuff like criminal law. And if you're an authoritarian, criminal law is really a tool that you want to play with. And so I also think for that reason, I kind of foot stomp Ev's point that there's a scary there's stuff you could do if you were bad at the federal level in Canada. Folks, we're going to leave it there. Louis Philippe, thank you so much for joining us
Thanks so
today.
much.
Uh, Apologies for taking up the first part of the show with an actual demonstration project in authoritarian government. Uh, Coming to you guys soon. It's we're we do it and then we export it, and there are no tariffs on authoritarianism. Folks, we're going to be back on Monday. It's going to be a blast. I think Holly wants to talk about the latest purge at CIA. Um, and so I'm going to not schedule a guest on Monday so that Holly can do that. We're going to have a conversation about that stuff. I don't know who else is going to be there, but you will, and I will, and Holly will, and it's going to be a blast. Talk to you later.